This section introduces Maturana's opening move and the wager that organizes the whole book. Cognition is a biological function, so the question, what is knowing, collapses into the question, what kind of system is a knower? Maturana's opening move fuses the epistemological and the biological into a single problem, and it refuses to treat objective knowledge as a description of a mind, independent world. The wager of the whole book is set right here. A living organization must be grasped as a unity, never as an enumeration of properties, because a list of nerve transfer functions never yields a system that thinks. The method is deliberately circular. No term, whether cognition, life, or interaction, receives a prior definition. Each one is justified only by the consistency of the finished theory. The parts are founded by the whole, and they are not assembled into it. This part explains why cognition resists being built up from its pieces. Cognition is a biological operation, and Maturana opens by denying that you can reach it through enumeration. List every transfer function of every nerve cell, and you hold a list, never a knower. The living must be grasped as a unity, defined by what it does as a whole. The sum of its parts never delivers the knower. Then comes the turn that cuts. Objective knowledge never describes what is known. The listener recreates it so knowing stays private and self-grounding, folding back on itself. The observer knows that he knows. The essay will justify each part only from the whole, mirroring the very organism it studies. So the answer to the question, what is cognition, arises only from inside the knower's capacity to know, or nowhere. This section states the single wager the whole book rests on. Cognition is something a living system does, a biological function to be explained the way any biological function is, from inside the organism, never by appeal to an outside it supposedly mirrors. That single wager is the entire chapter. Dissolve epistemology into biology. Everything the book will build, autopoiesis, the closed nervous system, the observer, is the debt this move incurs. From that wager, Maturana factors the inquiry into two orthogonal questions. The first is cognition as function, meaning what role it plays for the organism. The second is cognition as process, meaning the mechanism that realizes it. The rest of the book is just those two axes answered. Hold the factoring, and the answers follow from it. This part explains the single axiom that opens the book and the two coordinates it splits into. Knowing is an activity of a living system, so any theory of knowledge has to be extracted from the biology of the knower. Epistemology becomes a chapter of biology. That is the chapter's single axiom, stated almost without argument. It immediately splits the target into two coordinates that seed everything after. The first is cognition as a function, what the organism accomplishes in knowing. The second is cognition as a process, the mechanism that realizes it. The rest of the book is their joint answer. The generative move to keep is this. Relocate the observer inside the organism, so correspondence to a world drops out as the starting primitive, and the operation of the living system becomes the ground on which knowledge is built. Everything downstream is this axiom unfolded. This section explains what cognition is at its root. Cognition is not a picture the organism holds of a world. It is the organism staying alive. A living system persists only by keeping its circular organization unbroken. To hold it unbroken across a shifting environment, it must predict. What it predicts is classes of interaction that let the circularity survive one more cycle rather than particular events. That predictive closure is knowing. To live is to infer. The domain of interactions an organism can enter without dissolving simply is its cognitive domain. Nothing external certifies this. Every distinction is drawn by an observer, itself a living system. Cognition and life are one process. Read once from inside and once from inside, and once from outside. This section explains the chapter's single move, that to stay alive is already to know. A living system is a circular organization whose only product is its own continuation, and that closure silently defines the set of interactions it can survive. That set is its world. Entering it without disintegrating is the whole of cognition. Nothing is represented. A niche is predicted, and living is the acting out of the prediction. So mind needs no nervous system and no brain. Those merely widen the domain, letting the system interact with pure relations rather than only molecules. And the opening axiom bites. Anything said is said by an observer. Cognition can never be described from nowhere, only from inside another living circularity. This section explains why the unit of cognition is conduct rather than the neuron. The neuron looks like the atom of the brain, yet the chapter's whole force is to deny it that role. No cell can hold a fixed functional part when its transfer function drifts with the organism's history. So the functional unit is conduct itself, not the neuron, and not any fixed set of neurons. What makes this bind is a single move. A nerve cell responds to classes of afferent configurations, never to particular states, treating as equivalent whatever the observer would call unrelated. Identity is thus an invariant, preserved under changing substrate. Different neuronal states realize the same behavior, each merely subordinated to the maintenance of the living system's basic circularity. The pattern is substrate, agnostic identity, sameness, defined by the relation kept, not the matter keeping it. This section explains how Chapter 4 grounds the general claim in wetware, showing that the nervous system is closed on its own activity. A neuron never answers a particular input. It answers a whole class of afferent configurations, treating as one what an outside observer would call unrelated causes. The functional unit is therefore conduct itself, the loop that persists while every neuron keeps shifting its role. No single cell and no fixed circuit can carry that role. Cognition here is invariance over the system's internal relations, computed against the topology of its own sensory and effector surfaces, and answering to no correspondence with an external world. The particular case proves the general one. This section explains why 5 separate problems in the neurophysiology of cognition collapse into a single refusal. The refusal is this: the nervous system never touches an outside to represent. Each of its states is specifiable only by reference to other states of the same system. Internally and externally generated activity are indistinguishable to it. So representation is a category the observer smuggles in, never a neurophysiological fact. From this closure, everything else follows. Learning is the transformation of the capacity to synthesize behavior, not storage. Recall recreates conduct rather than retrieving an image. Meaning, time, and self-consciousness lie wholly in the consensual linguistic domain, absent as operant factors in the tissue. The generative move is to treat a system as operationally closed. Every question phrased as, "How does it represent the world?" reformulates into? How does it maintain its own invariant relations? This section states the chapter's single claim about the brain. The nervous system represents nothing. Each of its states is specified only by reference to its other states, so it is closed on itself, and no activity inside it is intrinsically about the world. From that one move, everything else follows. Learning stores no images, ideas, or symbols. It is the continuous transformation of the system's capacity to synthesize behavior, so recall is the recreation of an adequate action when conditions recur, not the retrieval of a trace. Meaning, time, and self-consciousness are the observer's descriptions in the linguistic domain, absent from the neurophysiology that the observer is trying to explain. This section states the 6 conclusions as a single theorem. Grant one axiom and the whole chapter unfolds. The living system is operationally closed, a self-referring circular organization whose every interaction its own organization already prescribes. From closure alone, everything follows. There is no apprehension of an independent world, only conduct within a bounded domain. Input, output, information, representation, environment, even reality as a field of independent entities are all relations the observer draws inside his own cognitive domain, never features of the organism. To know is to operate adequately, not to mirror. The 11 conclusions are one theorem, stated 11 times. Aboutness is always the observer's, closure is always the system's. Given the axiom, you can already generate the 12th. This section states what the whole book was built to prove. A living system is closed and self-referring, so its cognition creates a field of behavior inside that closure rather than apprehending an independent world. From this, one cut governs everything, what belongs to the organism against what belongs to the observer. Input, information, a goal, an independent reality, each one is the observer projecting his own descriptive domain into a system that has no outside. The instrument flight pilot is the figure. He only holds his gauge readings within their limits. The perfect flight through the darkness is his friend's description of his conduct, absent from his own operation. This part turns autopoietic closure back on the observer himself and shows why doing so removes the ground beneath ethics. Turn that closure on the observer and ethics loses its footing. A self-referring system has no fixed point outside itself, so the only reference for valid behavior is the maintenance of its own organization, and any final frame becomes relative by construction rather than by taste. No absolute value survives that closure. What remains is a single, unavoidable act. The self-conscious animal must explicitly choose its own frame of reference because none is handed to it. God and reason are the two classic evasions, with reason cheating by smuggling one domain's necessities into another. The honest remainder is aesthetic seduction, choosing the world you actually want to inhabit. This section turns the theory of autopoiesis onto the one doing the cognizing, and shows how absolute reference gives way. When the autopoietic account of cognition is turned back on the cognizer, absolute reference collapses. A self-referring system can ground truth only in its own maintained organization. So every frame of value is chosen, never discovered. Relativity here is structural, a property of the closure itself rather than a defect in it. The same closure redefines language. Language becomes the building of a shared domain of coordinated action, and the older picture of language as the transmission of information falls away. This is why no one is ever argued into a truth that was not already latent in their existing beliefs. What reads as an ethical appendix is really the theory's fixed point. The observer is one more autopoietic system. Reason, unable to step outside its own premises, resolves finally into preference. This part gives you the one move the chapter turns on. Ask what makes a machine that machine, and the answer is never its parts. It is the network of relations its parts must generate, what Maturana and Varela call its organization, as opposed to the particular structure that happens to realize it. From here, the living falls out as a single closure, a machine whose product is the very network that produces it, regenerating its own organization and drawing its own boundary in the process. That is autopoiesis, self-production. Purpose and function stay outside, in the observer describing the thing, never inside the machine itself. A machine is its organization, the network of relations. Its parts must realize, never the parts themselves. This section explains what that means and where autopoiesis sits inside it. The same machine can run on any material that can hold those relations. Autopoiesis is the fixed point of exactly this idea, the one machine whose product is its own organization. Its components continuously produce the very network that produces them, and that self-production is the single variable held constant. Everything else, purpose, input, output, boundary, lives in the observer's description, not in the system. From this one closure follow autonomy, individuality, and self-drawn boundaries. Living systems are precisely the physical autopoietic machines, autopoiesis being necessary and sufficient. Life becomes a topology of process rather than a kind of substance. This section explains why purpose can be removed from any account of a living system without losing anything. Purpose is a coordinate. The observer imposes from the outside. It is never a relation inside the machine itself. Once, autopoiesis specifies the organization, the components, and the rules. The states that follow are necessary outcomes. Every state arises whenever its conditions occur. Teleonomy adds no term to that generation. Function, goal, project, development, each of these names. A nexus. The observer draws between the system and an encompassing context that he himself selected. Drop the context, and the aim vanishes while the operation stays untouched. That is the mark of a gauge quantity rather than a physical one. So the move here is deletion. Strip teleology away, and nothing explanatory is lost. Living systems as physical autopoietic machines are purposeless. The apparent aim was always in the describer. This part explains where purpose actually lives when you look at a living machine. Purpose does not sit inside the machine. It is a relation, the observer adds, by embedding the system in a context and reading its outputs against that context. The mechanism only states relations among its components. States then arise as necessary outcomes when the conditions occur. Nothing is aimed at. So teleonomy narrates, it never causes. Anything whose course you can predict, you can retell as purposeful. Strip the purpose away, and the living organization loses no feature. What defines an organism was never a project. What defines it is autopoiesis, maintaining itself invariant. Living systems are purposeless. The chapter's move is subtractive. Remove the aim, and individuality slides to the center, self-maintenance, as the boundary of the unity. This section explains the single move the chapter installs, and why autopoiesis alone is enough to generate all of biology. The move is this. A living system is defined only by the relations that produce its own components, its constitution, its specificity, and its order, and by nothing else. That closed set of relations is the whole space the system lives in. Thermodynamics, energy, and ATP are structure, not organization. The cell is the anchor here. What matters is not that the cell is autopoietic, which is trivial, but how its molecular chemistry realizes exactly those three production relations. Here is the surprise the chapter turns on, stated flatly. Coding, information, and regulation are not in the system at all. They are the observer, projecting the autopoietic space onto the space of human design. That projection has a name, heteropoiesis. The role of this chapter in the larger arc is to prove sufficiency. Autopoiesis on its own generates all biological phenomenology, with no informational remainder. This part explains how. Chapter 3 proves its central claim, and why it refuses to do so by listing examples. The chapter opens by rejecting enumeration. You prove a claim not by cataloging its instances, but by showing it necessary and sufficient. To say that autopoietic systems are living systems, every biological phenomenon must reduce to autopoiesis, or fall under it, given the right non-determinate contingencies. The organization is then defined by what it does. It is a closed domain of production relations, constitution, specificity, and order, specifying its own space, realizable in any matter that can carry the required interactions. Thermodynamics stays structural, never constitutive. If the components can be materialized, the organization is realized and its energetics remain implicit. Substrate is contingent. Closure is the invariant. This is the step that does the work. It lets you predict any embodiment from the relations alone, with the cell being merely the next section's worked case. This section explains why the endless variety of living things reduces to a single fixed pattern. The smallest translational pattern here is one invariant defining relation with unbounded realizations. Autopoiesis is a single organization, the closed network of productions that produces itself and every living thing, whatever satisfies exactly, that produces itself, and every living thing, whatever satisfies exactly. Diversity is never diversity of organization. It is diversity of structure, the particular matter that happens to realize the one closure. So the whole phylogenetic profusion collapses to a constant and a free variable, with organization held fixed and structure ranging freely. Evolution then reads as structural drift under conserved organization rather than the appearance of new kinds of living. This is the invariant. Under transformation move, define the class by what stays fixed, and the visible variety becomes the orbit generated over that invariant. This section explains why the diversity of life never reaches its organization. The autopoietic organization stays invariant across every living thing. It is the single relation that defines a living unity, and diversity leaves it untouched. What varies is the realization, the concrete structure through which that one invariant is held constant. The whole spread of the living is degrees of freedom in how autopoiesis is satisfied, never in what autopoiesis is. The inversion that carries the chapter is this: reproduction and evolution do not define life. They are secondary, each presupposing a unity already standing. Unity comes first, and its maintenance subordinates every change. Reproduction comes only after, and evolution only after, and evolution only after that. So, predict any biological phenomenon by asking what it may not disturb. Diversity is the slack that constraint leaves free. This section explains why the presence of life is a matter of organization rather than substance. Life is not a stuff you detect, but an organization. You certify present or absent. The chapter's move is to stop asking what a system is made of, and ask instead whether it continuously makes itself a network of processes producing exactly the components that regenerate the network, boundary included. That closure is the living. Where it is present, the thing is alive, and the material realizing it, cell, chemistry, anything satisfying the relations becomes irrelevant. So presence is a diagnostic on relations, not a property of substance. It is a single criterion, necessary and sufficient, replacing every list of life's features. Identify the self-producing loop, and you have identified life. Fail to, and no inventory of parts restores it. This part explains why a living system counts as life at all. A living system is not a substance, it is a closure, the network of processes that continuously produces the very components that produce it. The claim of this chapter is that autopoiesis in physical space is necessary and sufficient for life. Reproduction, evolution, heredity, all demote to secondary phenomena riding on it. The generative move is this. A biological phenomenon is defined by the relations between processes subordinated to self-production, never by the properties of its components. The anchor separates the two cleanly. Two animals colliding by accident is mere mechanics. The same bodies touching in courtship is biological because that contact feeds the autopoiesis. Same physics, different membership. The understated consequence closing the book is this. Life so defined is formally specifiable and therefore buildable at will.